All right, so welcome to addressing the needs of all students using multi-tiered system of support. My name is Angie McKinney, and I'm one of the technical assistance specialists with the IEP Technical Assistance Center, formerly known as the Indiana IEP Resource Center. I'm here with two of my colleagues, and John, if you could introduce yourself first. John and Patrick will be handling your questions in the chat.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm John Purcell with the IEP Technical Assistance Center. Been with them 2 years and just really appreciate you being here tonight.
Hi, and I'm Patrick McKinley, Research Director with the IEP TA Center, and I am looking forward to working with you guys.
So John and Patrick and I have done quite a bit of training with districts around the state on multi-tiered system of support, and we have very different backgrounds. For me, my background is partly as a school psychologist for quite a few years, and then also working as a special ed administrator, as an assistant director of special ed. And so I've worked with a lot of different schools in different ways related to first RTI, and then later when things kind of broadened and changed a bit, multi-tiered system of support. So what you are getting tonight is the short version, right? So we offer this training as a full day training to teams periodically throughout the year. But in a virtual format, we wouldn't ask you to sit all day. And we have to shrink it down to kind of the bare bones. But we would invite you to check out some of our resources that I'm going to show you, and consider whether or not you maybe want to attend one of the full day trainings in the future if you want to know more about information that we're talking about today. So here's what we hope to cover in this short period of time today. I'm going to start with just kind of, well, we've already gone through kind of an orientation to tonight. We're going to hit the components of MTSS and the thinking behind it, some of the principles. We organize this in different domains of the things that we have to do in order to maintain this framework. So we're going to share a little bit about each of those. And then we'll also dip a little bit into some of the infrastructure and implementation considerations that you need in order to make this work and to make it stick, right? We don't like things in education that come along and we get really excited and then they disappear. And really, that's not what MTSS has turned out to be. We've been talking about it now for years. And before we started talking about it in Indiana, there were a number of other states that had been doing the same kind of practices for more years than we have. So it is here to stay. It really is, because it's an organizing framework that takes all of the wonderful things that we do in education and pulls them together, so that we're not operating in silos. We're using data from different systems that we have and just pulling everything together so that we make really good use of the resources that we have, which we know are limited. I mean, we don't have an unlimited amount of time, amount of money, amount of people, or other resources. So this is what we hope you get out of it, is just at least a little bit of each of these things. I want to show you first, this is the link to our MTSS trainings Padlet. And I'm going to pull that up really quickly just so that you can kind of see what's on here. But then you'll have this link. And actually, John or Patrick, if one of you could type that in the chat, I would appreciate that so people can access it quickly. This is what our Padlet looks like. Are you seeing the Padlet on the screen? Okay. A Padlet, if you've not seen one before, is kind of like an online bulletin board. It's a place to organize different resources, including websites, handouts. I've actually got this scrolled over a little bit. It scrolls left and right, and it scrolls up and down in each column. So you're going to find a copy of the handouts for tonight in this first column, only you're getting the full version. So what you see tonight is only a snippet of that full day training, so we don't have all of the slides included, but you will find those in that first column. So some different handouts there. I want to point you to a couple of key things here. When you go over to video resources, we have some things that we have done as far as videos, but we also have some other people who have done some trainings related to MTSS, some really good websites related to the topic, great places to find interventions. And I know that's what a lot of people want, is just tell me the good stuff, tell me the things to do. And in this column, you'll see some of the most notable resources to find actual interventions to use. A mental wellness screener that is a free screener that you could use. A couple more things that might be really helpful to any of you who serve middle and high school. We know that it's different. I mean, we recognize that it's a whole different beast when you're talking about a multi-tiered system of support. So there's some things in the secondary resources column that you might want to look into that are a little more tailored to secondary school. And then a few columns related specifically to reading, math, behavior. So lots and lots of good stuff here. And we're always adding to it. As we find a new resource, or one of you reaches out and says, hey, this is a really great place to look for information. Once that's vetted, we add it onto this Padlet. So keep this handy, and hopefully that will be a good resource to you. Get back to the PowerPoint here. All right. So some of the things that we hear out in the field are some of the misconceptions about MTSS. Again, that it's just here for a period of time and it's going to go away, and probably not. The way it looks, I really don't think it will. You also sometimes hear that this is how we address behavior, or this is how we address academics. It is academics, behavior, mental wellness. And the idea is that we don't really separate those. We know that they're all interconnected and intertwined, and we try to look through that whole child approach so that we're always making sure that if we're supporting academics and there's some behavior or mental wellness concerns, we're building those right into what we're doing, because they're going to work better when we consider them as kind of the whole package. It is definitely not for students with disabilities solely, and it's not about leaving them out of these interventions. It is everybody all the time. This is just how we operate, is using this framework. So a lot of things out there that are kind of misconceptions. I would say the biggest misconception, though, that it's not even on this chart, is the idea that this is just RTI with a new name, a new acronym. There is a little bit of truth to that. There really is. There are a lot of similarities. And I think if RTI had turned out to be what it was intended to be in the first place in Indiana, it would be very similar. However, we know that RTI kind of went wrong, right? It ended up being mostly a reading thing. And for a lot of districts, it ended up being a set of hoops or steps that we went through to get a kid tested for special education. And that's not what it was intended to be at all. So I think as we go through some of this, I will try to point out a couple of key things that are qualitatively different about the MTSS framework than what the thinking was in RTI, because you'll get those questions in your district from people. It is part of Indiana's Every Student Succeeds Act plan, as you'll kind of see in this graphic that was used when Indiana developed their ESSA plan. On the right-hand side of the graphic, it shows that even though we know that good teaching is about collaboration, good instruction, good assessment, using good curriculum, on the outer edges, you'll see it's encircled by using a multi-tiered system of support and the concept of universal design for learning. And there's a lot of overlap in the thinking behind those things as well. So it is, even though there's no money attached to providing or using MTSS as a framework, it really is about how to organize things, and it's expected from the state perspective of just the things that we do. When Indiana developed its ESSA plan, it had some specific guiding principles that they used. And I think some of these kind of point out a little bit of those differences between the thinking with RTI, response to intervention, and with MTSS. The biggest ones that stand out for me is the first two. So it is all children and all educators. So I think when we used to think about response to intervention, it was more like a process we entered into. We used it as a verb. We're going to RTI this student, right? Which meant we were going to have a meeting, we were going to develop interventions. But it really is, we are always under that framework all of the time. I may never need anything other than good tier 1 instruction, but I'm still part of the MTSS framework. And it really includes all the educators in your building too. We know we have to capitalize on all the resources that we have, which means there aren't teachers who are operating under the umbrella and teachers who aren't. We're always under that same umbrella. But all of these other things are really important too. We just know that those two things kind of really stood out different to me between RTI and MTSS. So it kind of starts with making sure that we all have some good beliefs, right? So we have to think about if our thinking and our understanding is that we believe every child has potential, right? Every child can learn and achieve to high standards. Now, those standards and the definition of high standards is different for every kid. This doesn't say, I believe that every kid can master all grade level standards. We know that most kids don't. But that we are always looking to raise the bar and raise the bar and raise the bar every time that we work with a student, and that we can move all kids from point A to point B. We also have to have a belief that if somebody doesn't have a skill, we teach it. So that learning and that teaching has to include not only the academic pieces, but the social competencies that are out there, the behavior skills, the regulation skills, social interaction skills, all of those things that we know that some kids come along developmentally and get those things naturally. But we know if they don't have a skill, it falls back on us to teach it. And so that becomes part of what do all kids need in order to be successful. We all have to change as well. As educators, we don't teach like we did even 10 years ago. I mean, I think for a lot of us, our practices changed dramatically when COVID came along. I'm not sure that I had even been on a Zoom meeting or done any trainings by Zoom prior to COVID. And in fact, you know, I was a little nervous when it first started happening. And now I have so few phone calls because almost every time it could have been a phone call, it's more productive to me to have a virtual meeting, just a very quick virtual meeting. We change. We have to, because our kids change, society changes, and the needs change all the time. And then finally, we have to have a good, solid belief that we're all responsible for all kids, no matter whether they're a kid in my classroom right now, a kid that I may have next year, a kid that I've already had and they're out of my classroom. We are all responsible for all children collectively. And it's that collective thinking that really does move our populations along in schools and produces good, strong outcomes. So I'm just guessing that each of you has a pretty strong belief in each of these areas, or you probably wouldn't have signed up for this training. You wouldn't go out of your way to attend a training to get better at something if you didn't have good, strong beliefs. But I bet you can also think that in your particular building, some of these may come very naturally, some of these may be strengths, and some of these may be not. So just quickly, I want you to think where your building, or for those of you who work at district level, where your district is related to beliefs. And I want you to hold that thought for a second and don't do anything yet. But if you think, okay, I don't know, I think this is a big area for us. We need to work on our belief system. So that would be a 1, all the way up to we're all in. We've got this. We're covered. And anywhere in between. So I want you to think about what your answer would be, and then go to the chat. And when I say go, you're going to enter your number. So it'll do just a nice little waterfall. So think of your number and you can hit enter. Threes, fours, twos, no ones. That's awesome, right? They're so far. And the idea here is that you probably would have a different number that you're putting in for each of those beliefs, because they're going to be different. Some come a little bit more naturally depending on your staff. But I just want you to have that thought that, you know what, if we find that we have one of those areas that tends to be a big barrier, which is also a big opportunity for growth, right? If you want to reframe that a little bit, that can kind of hinder our process for getting a framework in place that's going to be helpful. When we have those roadblocks, though, and we can identify them ahead of time and start to work on those ideas and beliefs with your staff, you're going to have a much easier time making this framework work within your district or building. So this shifts your thinking a little bit, using this kind of a framework from what's going on with the kid that we need to fix, what's wrong with this problem or with this student, to thinking about what are some of the variables that we actually could alter. We could change how we approach things. We could change how we instruct on something, how we support a student, what the classroom environment is like, all of those different things that we have control over. Because many times when we start altering those variables, that we see positive outcomes for students. And it may not have been a kid issue as much as a match issue with the instruction or the environment or any of those kinds of things in the learning environment that maybe just weren't working for that student. Like I mentioned before, one of the shifts in thinking is to really having that whole child approach. And that's really important as we develop supports and interventions for students. So if you have a student who is struggling in their reading class, they're just behind in multiple areas of reading, then if we take that to a problem-solving team, and the problem-solving team is just really looking at the reading, they're going to develop reading interventions, right? We want that to be more specific, obviously. We want to get down to what exactly it is in reading that they're struggling with, but it's going to be something related to reading. But if we really take that whole child lens and we think, you know what, this is a student who is struggling in reading, yes, but they're also getting reading the first thing in the morning. They are frequently absent or late to school, so they're missing that instruction a lot of the time. Mom and dad are in the midst of a divorce and are fighting at night, keeping this student up. Nobody's getting this kid up in the morning, which is probably why they're late half the time. Nobody's fixing breakfast. When this kid does show up and is sitting in class, puts their head down on the desk, right, falling asleep, suddenly your focus of the intervention changes. It really shifts, how are we going to support this student? Because a reading intervention may not have a whole lot of impact unless we address some of those other things, unless we address some of the additional supports that are needed for the student. It's important to think not only of what the student needs, but not thinking about where they are in the proverbial triangle, right? But what does that kid's individual triangle look like? So every kid does not get a spot on the triangle. If they are their own triangle, then it's what is okay? What is a strength for me that I don't need any additional supports? Those green areas. What are the things that I need a little bit more support than one of my peers does? And are there things that are standing out as I need some intensive supports in order to be successful? And I bet each of you could probably create your own little triangle. And it may not look like this. Hopefully we've got a lot more green things on there than anything. But I know I've at least got some things in that yellow area that say, you know what, I was driving to a school the other day and realized if I didn't have GPS, I wouldn't have gotten there. I mean, it was such a complicated way to get someplace. So, I think we always have to think about what are those individual needs. So we're not thinking of a student as a tier 2 student or a tier 3 student. We're thinking of a student that has specific needs for support or extension in one or more areas. So this is what the framework that we use at the IEP TA Center looks like. And we are going to dip mostly into this multiple tiers of instruction and intervention, because that's what most educators are really familiar with, is looking at, what are the tiers? What does tier 1 look like, tier 2, tier 3, the intervention piece. But these other domains, which we won't really have a lot of time to get into on a deep level today, but they're incredibly important for making this all tie together and stick. And I think that's something that I would invite you to later on really look at even more, is the other domains and how they support what you do. Because this is part of the reason why response to intervention kind of floundered in Indiana in most districts, is we did a pretty good job, but it never really took hold enough to give us really good outcomes, because we weren't paying attention to a lot of the other domains related to this. So hopefully you'll see what I mean kind of as we go along. But I'm going to start with the multiple tiers of instruction and intervention. And I would tell you that if you get absolutely nothing out of this webinar other than this one thing, it should be that tier 1 is your most important tier. Tier 1 is where your school is spending the majority of their time, the majority of their resources, and impacting every single student in your building. So tier 1 is our first best instruction. And we design this based on what we know about our students. We try to design this in a way that we think ahead of time is going to meet the needs of 80% or more of our kids by just doing this at a core level. So we select our textbooks. We design how many minutes each class is going to be held. We assign aides to different classrooms. We determine how many minutes are going to be part of passing periods. I can't even imagine how many different decisions are made at that administrative and leadership level to say, we're going to set this up for success. That's what tier 1 is all about. And remember, we're talking about academics, we're talking about behavior, we're talking about mental wellness, all of the important things that are part of that student's world. We want to make sure that we're always using good, solid, evidence-based programs and practices. And I think we do that for the most part. Occasionally, we get maybe a little sidetracked by the really good salesman who comes in with something new. but it's a program that maybe doesn't have a lot of research behind it. We're usually disappointed when that happens, when we start looking at outcomes a couple years later. But if we know that something is evidence-based, and you're going to know that by looking at the research behind it, you can find that by looking at some of those sites on the Padlet that point you to good, solid programs. So we start with evidence-based programs. We also make sure that we have good goals, which means we need to understand before we start what we expect all students to be able to know, understand, and do. What are we wanting to teach them? You know, what do we want them to walk away from their kindergarten experience being able to do academically, behaviorally, mental wellness wise, because that looks different for a kindergartner than it does for a second grader, sixth grader on up, right? It always looks different. And we can't just say, well, we want them to know the standards. We want them to be able to pass the iRead test or the iLearn test. Yes, we want those things too, but getting down to the nitty gritty of really what do we expect them to be able to know, understand, and do? How are we going to know if they've gotten there or not? That's where our data comes in, and we'll talk about data next. And then what is our plan for either when they don't get there or when they were there to begin with, right? When we have those few students who already were able to do something before we even started instructing on it, if we don't extend the learning for those kids, we may end up with some behavioral issues, some attention issues, things like that that we don't want. We don't want to create those issues. When we're talking about using assessments, we do this through our universal screening and benchmarking. So many of you are using things like NWEA, iReady, Dibbles, AimsWeb. I mean, we've got tons of things out there academically, right? We do a pretty good job with academics, at least for reading, partly for math, not so great for writing, right? We do a lot of writing in schools, but having a systematic way of getting that 30,000-foot view of how's our school doing? How's our fourth grade doing? How's Mrs. Jones' room doing, right? And dipping down at that level to say, what do we need to change in our core instruction to make that better than it is? That's what Tier 1 is all about. Behavior. If you guys could just throw in the chat, what kind of data do you use for behavior, mental wellness, social, all of that kind of stuff? What are some of the things that you're using? And remember, it does not have to be a test, right? It doesn't have to be an assessment that we've purchased and administered. It can just be good data sources. Behavior logs, morning check-ins, journals, observations, absolutely. Surveys, discipline referrals, so office referrals, things like that. I don't know about branching minds. Nurse visits, oh my gosh, absolutely. Attendance, check-in, check-out information, parent communication logs, so many good things here. Great. So again, it's data that's going to be able to tell you how are we doing as a whole. So we always have referral data. We always have attendance data. We always have, nurse visit data. The idea is to make sure that we're sitting down periodically, so at least 3 times a year, and deliberately looking at that data as a whole from many different angles so that we can say, we are doing great with this, or we need a little work in this area, or, oh my gosh, what are we going to do, right? So every time that we look at that data in a very systematic way, it's telling us about kind of the health of our system and what needs to happen next. We also have to make sure that we're always looking at the fidelity of the instruction and implementation that's happening. We can't say that something is not working if it's not really in place, or if it's not in place correctly or with the right dosage that we intended to. You know, if we are doing a school-wide program that's 60 minutes a day every day, but we never get 60 minutes in on it, then we don't know whether that program was good or not. We just know that as we're implementing it now, it's not working, right? So always looking at the fidelity so that we can make better informed judgments about how we're doing. All right, so we won't do this kind of together, but I just want you to always be thinking about within your own district, within your own school, how are things going as far as what are you using for your core instruction in all those areas? And what screeners or assessments are you using? It's really important to kind of take stock in what you already have going, because even if you tell me that, well, our school isn't using MTSS, well, you probably kind of are to some degree because you've got a lot of good things going on. It's a matter of pulling them into that framework so that you know where the gaps are, where the holes are, and are able to start filling those things in. Now, sometimes our triangle doesn't look so healthy, right? Sometimes our schools are spending as much or more effort on interventions as they are on just that tier 1 instruction. When more of our kids are needing intervention than are doing well from the intervention, there's an issue. It tends to be a huge resource drain, which is hard on schools. I mean, because again, our resources are not unlimited. Sometimes this is because the core instruction that we have, what we put in place at tier 1, just either wasn't good, wasn't a good match. Maybe it would be great for somebody else, but not for us. Or it could be that it just was not implemented with fidelity. Could be from COVID. We're still trying to make up for that learning loss. I think some states are saying, oh, we've conquered the learning loss. We're back to where we were. I don't think so. I don't believe any of them. I don't care what their data says. I don't believe them at this point because we're seeing it. We're seeing it especially with behavior. That is really standing out for a lot of elementary schools more than anything, is those young kids coming in that just aren't students yet. They're not operating as students. Or it could be that you've had a flipped triangle for a long time. So that's a possibility. So I just want you to think about what you can do in those situations where your triangle is flipped. First thing to do is make sure that you strengthen tier 1. Don't start just intervening. When you start putting all of your resources into, we need this intervention and this intervention and this intervention, we need to hire more people to do interventions. It's like putting 100 Band-Aids on a gunshot wound, right? You can keep putting Band-Aids on. That's not going to solve the issue. We need to go back to that core level of what do we do at the base, the actual tier 1 instruction. See whether you need some additional data. Sometimes we aren't looking at the full picture because we haven't pulled together data that's representing the whole system. We want to look for any patterns in this. Is it certain grade levels, certain groups, certain classrooms that are really pulling those resources? And you could also consider class-wide intervention. We don't have time to get into class-wide intervention very much, but I just wanted to mention this. There are some additional resources on the Padlet that you could look at, and there will likely be a training specifically focused on this coming next semester. So with tier 1, we want to look at that benchmarking data and just see how close are we to 80%. Because if you tell me you're at 79, I'm going to be praising your school for that, right? That's 80% is kind of the goal. But if we get close to that, that's pretty good. Are we using evidence-based programs? Are we doing it with fidelity? Do we need to scrap it and do something new? Which there are some schools out there that have been using reading instruction that is not giving them what they're looking for. And some of them are choosing to say, we're starting from square one and we're going to put in something different. There are others that have programs that they think, you know, it's not bad, but it's got some gaps. It's got some holes. So can we supplement it with something else to make it stronger? So just a lot of things to think about there. With class-wide intervention, it is something that is reaches more students and saves you quite a bit of time and resources. But the biggest thing for me about a class-wide intervention is when we do this, the kids who needed it grow. The kids who didn't need it grow. And I think that's really important because, you know, we're always worried about, well, if I do this for this pocket of kids, are these kids going to suffer? Are these kids going to be bored? With the way that class-wide intervention is set up, it actually tends to see growth for both ends of that spectrum, which is good. We also want to make sure that we're always using good things that have a high impact and show a lot of growth. We want things, and this is, I know, a little bit complicated on effect sizes, but we want things that show an effect size of greater than 0.4. Because when we get to about 0.4, we're talking about what is typically accomplished within a year. Well, most of the kids that we're concerned about and that we're putting interventions out for are kids who are behind, which means they need to grow more than a year, right? We want to close the gap for them. And in order to do that, we're going to need to have things that have a stronger effect size. So there are a lot of things out there that really have some good promising results behind them. And so you can see these are all quite a bit over 0.4. Some of these things are class-wide intervention based, such as planning and predicting. We can use summarization, the good behavior game, response to intervention. The research on that shows that just by going through that kind of process, 1.29. That's huge. That's absolutely huge. So a lot of good things that we can do. There is a link on the Padlet to visiblelearning.com, which is John Hattie's website. That's a place where you can go to actually look at his list and ranking of various programs and processes so that you can make sure we're not putting something in place that just isn't going to pay off, isn't going to be worth the time to even do. All right, let's jump into tier 2. Here's what you need to know about tier 2. Number 1, it is always supplemental to the core instruction, which means I don't take you out of your 90-minute reading block to give you a different instruction. What you're going to get first, whether it's in the gen ed room, in the special ed room, I don't care where it is, if that is what we think is going to have the best impact, that is your tier 1. But beyond that, if that wasn't enough, I'm going to give you more in addition to that 90 minutes. So it's supplemental to that core instruction. But the bigger issue for me is that it has to be targeted, which means I'm not just going to give you more reading. It's what is it about your reading that you're struggling with? Is it decoding? Is it phonemic awareness? Is it comprehension? Tell me what exactly we need to focus on so that when you get this support or this additional instruction, it is tailored to what you need. Because if you give me something that isn't tailored to what I need, you could be giving me something I already have, and that's wasted time. Or you could be giving me something I'm not ready for. If my issue is with phonemic awareness and you want to work on comprehension strategies, I'm not ready yet, right? We've got to get down to that core level of what's going on. And again, we're going to be targeted whether we're talking about an academic skill, whether we're talking about a behavior related skill or a mental wellness kind of need. any of those areas. If, for example, if you're a student with anxiety and I just put you in a behavior group, doesn't make any sense, does it? I mean, it's like giving you the wrong medicine. So we have to make sure that we know enough about what's going on with the student to have the right things in place. The biggest thing that you can do with tier 2 is to think about, okay, if we've got maybe 20% of our students on a good day that need this supplemental support, I can't meet on 20% of our student population. I just can't. We don't have enough time to be able to do that. So one of the workarounds for this is to use some of your existing structures that already exist, your PLC meetings, your grade level team meetings, your content area meetings, whatever you've already got going on. And when you're looking at your data, problem solve the needs. So if I'm a group of 4th grade teachers and we all get together and we're looking at, okay, your kids, my kids, you know, how are all of our different classrooms doing? And we start hearing, you know, it's that multi-digit multiplication that's really, I've got so many kids that are struggling with this, right? So when we start coming up with that as a need, let's problem solve, how are we going to meet that need? And then we can all plug kids in and out of whatever the support or resource that we've designed, as opposed to, I'm going to have a meeting on John, I'm going to have a meeting on Patrick, and on and on and on. You're going to meeting yourselves to death if you do it that way. So coming up with very specific things to help meet the needs that you see coming up over and over again for students. As we start to ask questions, we have to know a little bit about where students are starting from and where we would like them to be. Does this sound familiar to any of you who work in the special ed world? It's a lot like writing an IEP. We get kind of that present level of performance before we can set a goal, and then we can decide what it's going to take service-wise to get there. It's the same thing when you're designing interventions. It's that idea of, you know, it's not just that we have this support or service, it's what support or service does this kid need and how much of it do they need? With that comes a need for more data. We have to make sure that we're collecting assessment data more frequently in order to be able to make good decisions about it. We know that it takes, at a bare minimum, like 4 to 6 data points to be able to even see a trend in that data and know what to do with it. And that really is a minimum estimate. So if we're assessing, just getting benchmarking data is only 3 times during the year. Plus, that data tends to be very, very broad. And so as we start collecting data for progress monitoring, it's a different kind of data. If my concern is reading fluency, I want a reading fluency measure. I want to know how many words I can read per minute. I don't care how I do on a STAR test. I don't care how I do on NWEA overall. That may not tell me what I need for fluency. So your assessment measures here should be quick, they should be cheap or free, and they should be easy to do. So a quick measure of reading fluency, a quick math probe that tells me how they're doing on a particular skill that we're working on. For things like behavior, things like mental wellness, it may be as simple as identifying what it is that we're concerned about and keeping hash marks on a Post-it, or the teacher who is monitoring what's going on during a particular hour of the day and they keep a pocket full of paper clips, and every time something happens they transfer one over from the left pocket to the right pocket so that at the end they can just count how many paper clips have moved into that other pocket. Simple as possible, right? At least monthly. Sometimes you want more data than that, but at minimum, we would recommend that you're collecting data at least monthly. We're still going to be using evidence-based instruction, and we still want to make sure that things are happening with fidelity. Now, I would also encourage you to think about within your school or your district, having something written that will tell you a little bit more about what is expected for teachers. Like having a nice menu of interventions of when you see data that points you in this direction, when you see data that falls below this level or above this level or whatever it is that we're talking about, then we've got a solid intervention for a concern area, and we have at least one backup. It's always good to have a menu of tools that are readily available that we feel like we can handle those things. We've had some training, we've got the resources, you know, all that kind of stuff, without it turning into the Cheesecake Factory menu. So if you've ever been to the Cheesecake Factory, I mean, it actually is spiral bound. And I know when we go there, I'm like, I don't even know where to start, right? And we don't want to give people like a huge intervention manual where they have 15 things to choose from for phonemic awareness, because they're not going to be proficient in 15 different interventions. But we get 2 to maybe 3, and at least somebody in my building is going to know what they're doing. I can watch them do it. They can coach me through it, whatever needs to happen, so that when we do it right and are more likely to have good outcomes. All right, tier 3. Quite honestly, if you asked me a scenario of here's the intervention, here's how often we're doing it, is it tier 2 or tier 3? There's no right or wrong answer, right? There's no clear line that says this is tier 2 and this is tier 3. It really is about creating a visual representation for staff to say, as things get more intense, as the needs are bigger and kids are not responding to the lesser supports, we need to make them stronger. We need to make them more individualized. We need to make them more customized for the student. That's really what tier 3 is all about. So whether you're in tier 2 or tier 3 as far as providing supports really doesn't matter. I mean, it's kind of arbitrary. It's more about, if that wasn't enough, let's do something else. Let's do something different, more, whatever. Now with tier 3, this is kind of the place where when you feel like things have gotten very intensive for a student, we need to have a meeting on the student. We need to make sure that even though we were trying to use a whole child lens before, that at this point, if what we did for tier 2 was not enough, we've got to take a deliberate look at what's going on with the whole picture with the student. Because sometimes interventions are not effective at tier 2 because it was an intervention for reading, and I also need some behavior support or some attention support, right? If I can't focus during the intervention, I don't get anything out of it. If my meds wear off at 2 o'clock and my intervention is scheduled from 2 to 3, I don't get anything out of it. If I'm a student who can't operate in a larger group, and at tier 2, we were doing something that was, 5 to 7 kids in a group, I may need to be in with just 1 or 2 other students. It might be more effective then. So as we start to individualize, we can individualize and intensify by giving it more minutes, more frequency, more customized aspects to that intervention, changing the setup, changing the environment of it. We can also intensify by increasing the expertise of the person who's delivering that intervention. So if you're doing a social skills intervention, the teacher could potentially do some of that initially, but to have the school social worker do that is kind of a whole different level, or the school counselor, or the school psychologist. So thinking about how do we make it just more and more and more intense. There is a nice module on the National Center for Intensive Intervention which is listed on the Padlet as intensiveintervention.org. There's a nice module on data-based individualization, which a lot of that focuses on how do we ramp things up from tier 2 to tier 3. And so I would encourage you to look at that if you have time. They do a really good training on that. Assessment's the same, other than even more frequent. Weekly assessment gives us more data and more opportunity to make those changes when needed. When my daughter was in elementary school, her school had, they called it built-in RTI math and RTI reading. So this was before the MTSS language kind of came around. And I, as a school psychologist, I was thrilled. As a mom of a student who did not like math, I also knew that she was struggling in math. And I remember kind of at the start of the second 9 weeks, going in for parent-teacher conferences. And I sat down with her teacher and I said, all right, tell me about math. She said, well, Veronica's in the lowest math RTI group. I'm like, well, I kind of expected that, but how's she doing in there? Oh my gosh, she's my top student in there. She's helping everybody else because she already knows all the stuff that we're working on. And I said, well, if she already knows that stuff, shouldn't she move up to the next group because she's probably not getting anything out of that? She's like, oh, no, we can't do that. We don't make changes until the end of the 9 weeks. So within the MTSS framework, the idea is when you have data that says we need to do something different, we need to make a change, when you've got enough data, you make it, right? You give kids what they need, when they need it, for as long as they need it, and then not more, right? We only have so many resources to go around. So when you need to back down to tier 2, we do it. When you need to increase to tier 3 or to give additional supports or to change the focus, we do it. But we never know when to do it unless we're paying attention to the data and constantly looking at that data. One thing that you can do, and you'll find a form, a blank form kind of like this on the Padlet, is just to take stock in what do you already have going on. And you can do this for supports, but you can also do this looking at your assessment data to see what do we already have, what are we doing well, what holes do you see, where do we not have data that we need, where do we not have supports that we need. If we have a lot of behavior need and not a lot of behavior supports, then we need to start expanding those. Sometimes we can look at, after we've inventoried our own resources, we can look at things and think, oh my gosh, we have like 15 things going on for decoding. Why do we have 15 things going on for decoding when we didn't really need all 15 things? Because sometimes what we see is certain teachers are attached to a practice or a program or certain grade levels when other grade levels have moved on to things that are maybe more effective. Sometimes we also see things that show up that we know if that one person who is running the show for that particular practice were to retire, move, whatever, it's going away because nobody else knows how to do it. So I think it's really good to get that big picture of what's going on within your building. This was actually done by a district. And so this cut across multiple grade levels, buildings, things like that. But this was kind of the start of their process where they started looking at, oh my gosh, we don't have a lot of stuff going on in this particular area. And we have some things that are tied to a person that are happening. So the question often comes up when we do trainings of, okay, well, what about all the other stuff that we do? Where does it fit in? Because there's sometimes that misconception that tier 1 is what happens in gen ed, tier 2 is what happens in small group down the hall, and tier 3 is special ed. And that's not the way it works. There is no place or person assigned to any of these things. It depends on how it's organized within your district. I've also heard people say, well, you know, we've got tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and then we've got this other triangle outside of the triangle, and that's where students with disabilities fit in. Everybody's in the triangle. Everybody's under the umbrella, right? So we are all part of this. So if we think about all of those different things that we do, we've got high ability programs. We have, and this is kind of old language, but multilingual learner supports, title, using differentiation, special ed, all of those different things. The answer really for all of them is they can fit at all levels in different ways. And I'll just give you a couple of examples to hopefully have this kind of make sense. So if you're thinking, I put specially designed instruction right in the core of this because that is what is needed for a student who qualifies for special ed. It's all about the specially designed instruction that they need because they need instruction that is maybe a little bit different than what everybody else needs. So when we know that about a student, when we know what they need, we start building it into their core instruction. Again, whether that instruction happens in the gen ed classroom with the gen ed teacher, in that gen ed classroom with a little bit of special ed support in there, in a resource room, doesn't matter. We know what we know about the student. So if my specially designed instruction is that I need pre-taught vocabulary and I need explicit direct instruction on behavior, okay? We're gonna build that into what I get in my tier 1 during reading, during math, during social studies. I don't care. Everything that we do, it has to be deliberate, and I need that pre-taught vocabulary. Now, if I happen to need a tier 2 social skills group, right? And I'm in a group with 5 to 7 other kids, it may or may not have anything to do with my disability. It may just be a need that I have. But if I'm going into that group, I need pre-taught vocabulary and I need explicit direct instruction if it comes to anything related to behavior. That need doesn't change because of the person I'm with, the room I'm in, the group I'm in. The need is the need. And the same thing if I needed maybe a more individualized or very small group kind of intensive support, that need's still there. If you take differentiation, we differentiate in the classroom. Good teachers, that's what they do. They differentiate to meet the needs of the variety of learners that are in the classroom. But if I have a group, let's go back to that social skills group. My 5 to 7 kids in that social skills group are 5 to 7 different individual human beings. And I'm probably going to have to differentiate a little bit within that group to make it work and to make them really get what they need to out of that. And even within a check-in, check-out system, if it's just me checking in, checking out with a teacher, I'm going to differentiate a little bit because we're going to be very deliberate about who the student gets matched up with, right? To do that check-in, check-out. We may have to do it 3 times a day and change it up a little bit because this student needs more frequent check-in, check-out. We may have to do it in a visual format instead of, just on paper, with words because the student needs something different. We're differentiating everything we do. So all of these things can be applied at all levels. And I think that's a really important piece. Again, if you guys have questions along the way, I know we are crunching a lot into an hour and a half, so I'm going to keep moving. But if you have questions that you want to put in the chat, John and Patrick can respond to those questions at any time. So please share any of those. All right, so let's go back to our domains, and we're just, again, going to kind of surface level look into each of these so that you know a little bit about them. And we're going to start with leadership because leadership is a really important piece. We know that it has to start with that building leader. And oftentimes it's starting at the district level with some district leadership saying, this is what we are going to do as a system. But it has to kind of be a top-down procedure because there are so many things that are dependent on the decisions that are made and the resource allocations that are made that come from that leadership level. So starting with principal leadership, creating those structures at the building level that are the leadership team related to MTSS. Now, I want to differentiate this a little bit from thinking of maybe your problem-solving team for MTSS. This may not be the same group of people. This is more likely to be your team that, like a school improvement team, another leadership kind of team. The idea is when they come together, they become the people who make it all happen. They become the people who say, you know what, our people need training on this kind of intervention. We need to schedule more collaboration time for teachers to be able to meet. We need to put some structures or some procedures in place so that everybody knows what they're doing. This is the team that figures that kind of stuff out and makes it happen. And you want to make sure that this team is representing different grade levels, different content areas, so that they're a good representation of the whole school. Now that team needs to be the people who are the go-to people, which means they've got to know a little bit more than everybody else in the building so that they can answer the questions. They need to have that ongoing professional development to keep getting better and better at what they do, so that they are a resource. They're not just in name only. They're also going to be looking back to see what's going on our school improvement plan. And how will the MTSS framework support what we're looking to accomplish through our improvement plan? I've yet to see a school improvement plan that I didn't think using the MTSS framework wouldn't help. You know, everyone that I see, I'm like, well, if we just had really good MTSS in place, we would see this. We would see improved reading. We would see better connections with parents, you know, all of the things that we tend to put on those plans. We want to make sure that there is alignment so that you're not working at more things, you're just lining it all up. You're organizing it better. Capacity building is really important too, because if we exceed our capacity, we just burn out, right? We've got to make sure that we've got some things in place within the building to say, okay, we can handle these things. So it starts with really building a common language and understanding of MTSS. And I think that starts with the school or the district having a conversation about what is it going to look like for us? How are we going to define MTSS? Like if I'm at Indianapolis Public Schools, what does MTSS look like at IPS? Which may be different than what it looks like at Bartholomew County Schools or, you know, any other school corporation that's out there. So I think that's really important to say. We need to make sure that we're not just bringing in something that some outside people are talking about. We're making it ours. We're making it work within our district. So having that common language and understanding, making sure that the leadership team is facilitating the professional development needs for staff and is there to provide coaching as needed. I mean, I could be told what to do, when to do it. You could even probably tell me how to do it. And when I go to do it, I may do it wrong. So having a go-to person that I can check back in with and, you know, explain this to me again, come watch me do it. Is there somebody else I could watch? You know, things like that to really build up the capacity of what we do. And not only about the interventions, but also on how do I use data? Like we tell teachers a lot of times, look at your classroom data. Okay, I'm looking. I don't know what to do with this, right? It's a lot of numbers. What does this mean? Having some support around that, some support around administering the assessments. It's very possible that we have people out there administering regular assessments that when we look back, like, you know, I don't think we did that right. It may not be usable data if we didn't use it right. Tiffany, that is a great question. We do. We actually, when schools request any sort of support around MTSS, they submit a technical assistance request through our website, and we go out there and work directly, because you guys are getting like really minimal training here. But what we do directly when we work with the building is say, okay, here are the things you're already doing. How do we take that to the next step? How do we take that to the next level? And no, everything is free that we do. So the never a cost unless you're coming to one of our trainings where there is food, and that's usually just our big conference for the year. Another really big issue related to capacity is how we schedule things. So again, if I came into your building tomorrow and said, oh my gosh, here are your needs, you need to make sure teachers are doing these different interventions, you make sure they're working together, you make sure they are looking at their data, that they're collecting data, all this kind of stuff. You say, yeah, when are we going to do this? There has to be time in the schedule to make sure that we can do these things. There has to be time for teachers to get together and talk about things. So getting the PD that we need, right? If we say in a district that we're committed to MTSS, but we don't build in any time for our teachers to get training, how's it going to happen, right? So building in that time is really important. There are a couple of books on the Padlet that I would encourage you to look at, and they're called It's About Time. And not like it's about time, but it's about time. And they are stories. One is written from an elementary perspective and one from a secondary, about how different districts, real districts, decided what they wanted time for and made time for it, and how they accomplished that. It's kind of an interesting read. And if anybody ever wanted to check out one of those books, we'd be happy to loan out a copy, mail it, as long as we get it back. I don't think we have any extra copies of those, but I'm happy to share that with anybody if you wanted to reach out to me. Having good processes and procedures in place are really important, so that we're promoting equity within what we do. And what I mean by that is that, sometimes we have a student with a particular learning profile and set of data in classroom A that gets support, and that same profile and same data in classroom B doesn't. Because if our teachers don't know when I should act, when I should implement, and there's no hard and fast rule for any of those things, then sometimes it just doesn't happen. So you get some kids who get support and some who don't, and that's not equity, So we're always making sure that we put as many things in place to support teachers, which in turn supports practices for students. And then we've got to figure out where those resources are. Where can we free up some things? Lots of really critical things to think about in building that capacity. With communication and collaboration, everybody's going to know about it. If all staff are part of MTSS, that means all staff have to know about it. I've even been in some buildings where when they've had their block of time for intervention, every staff member in the building was up for grabs for providing support, from the front office secretary to the title teachers to every instructional assistant in the building, even sometimes the custodians. I mean, literally, some schools have just said, we're going to use everybody because we've got such needs going on in the building. It's important that as you start gathering some internal data on how we're doing as a system, that you start feeding that back to your staff as well. If we're doing a great job with MTSS as a whole, and maybe a great job in one domain versus the whole thing, letting staff know, hey, we're doing a great job with leadership this time, or we're doing a great job when it comes to using our data. And where are some of the barriers? What are some of the things that we're going to still be working on? How are we going to let parents know what we're doing? How do we involve them in this process and use this to connect with parents even more, to share out some of the wonderful things that we're doing? With problem solving, the idea here is have a process. I mean, that really is the bottom line when it comes to problem solving, is that we're using a problem solving process. And there are lots of different models for problem solving out there. You know, everything from a very simple, you know, first we're going to identify the problem, then we're going to analyze the problem, then we're going to develop interventions and put them in place, and then we're going to look at the outcomes. We're going to evaluate the process as a whole. And it's usually a very cyclical process of we're constantly in some form of that problem solving. You may have other problem solving processes that are already in place, like during your PLCs, during your, you know, other kinds of meetings. You may have a structure for problem solving. It really doesn't matter what you're using as long as you're using a process. And some of you who maybe have been around for a while in schools and have been to some of the RTI meetings, I can remember being in a lot of RTI meetings where we were trying to meet on like 5 different kids during an hour, which just doesn't work anyway. And there would be a whole lot of venting time, like a good chunk of the time was venting and, you know, just general, let me tell you all the horrible things that are happening. And then we would kind of cram down to that last minute and say, so what are we going to put on this plan, right? There was no problem solving that happened. It was venting, plan development, venting, plan development. It wasn't a good systematic way of how do we use the data to guide us through what we do next. So we've got to have that database problem solving that not only looks at that individual student, but looks across different content areas, grade levels. How are we doing at different tiers? How are we doing as a whole, as a school or as a school system? Using that data to identify where those gaps are. And again, many of our benchmarking systems are very clear in telling us these kids are fine. And quite honestly, most of the kids who are just fine, we knew it before the data ever got administered. Most of the kids who are really struggling, yeah, we knew that too, right? That's pretty easy. It's those in-between kids that we're not sure. Where are they in relation to that line? Are they okay? Are they okay enough? Are they at risk? Right? So we get a lot of those benchmarking kinds of data sources that will identify kids as at risk. That tends to be a kind of a qualifying term that says, let's look a little deeper with this kid. So it's not just that I showed up with a particular score. Now we take a look at how do they do on a daily basis? How do those classroom assessments look? Because I may have had a bad day when I took that assessment, or I could still have some pretty significant concerns. It really depends on the students. We need to have data that kind of tells us a lot of different things. Why is a student struggling? What do we do about this, right? How do we dig into that? And then whenever we determine that a student has a need and why they might have that need, then we're developing plans based on those reasons. It's also important for us to problem solve again across different groups, different student groups, whether we're looking, you know, dividing things out, looking at different races, different grade levels, different socioeconomic statuses. You know, we always use that free and reduced lunch group. Just seeing, are there pockets of kids that are struggling more? Because if so, we need to do something different. We need to adjust so that we're providing the supports that they need. Our students that come from a different language background, what do we need to do differently there? And sometimes we need to shift the intervention so that it aligns better for that particular group of students. And then again, we want to use the problem-solving process also to figure out where are our barriers related to that MTSS framework. So we can problem solve our own stuff to say, what's keeping us from being successful at Tier 2? What's keeping us from having enough time to be able to do A, B, and C? Any of those things, we can use data to then point us back to how do we make this an even better or stronger process? And then skipping to that last domain with data evaluation. Number one, staff have got to have a good understanding of the data they see, but they also have to have access to that data. And we think that, yeah, of course they have access. Not everybody does. I was in a school a couple of years ago, and when I was asking, some school counselors were developing some behavior support groups and social, emotional, or mental wellness support groups related to what students needed based on their data. And I said, oh, so you get in and you look at the data, what all the data sources do you look at? And they're like, well, no, we don't actually have access. We have to ask for this data and then they export it for us. I'm like, that's a barrier, right? That's a barrier that doesn't need to exist. Having good access to that stuff is what they need. And I think sometimes classroom teachers, they have access to certain data. They may need a broader access than we originally thought. And we also don't want to have them dig really hard for data because they won't. They don't have time. They simply do not have time. So having access, but then also having a good understanding and having data that answers these different questions. And sometimes we have data that answers some of the questions, but not all of them. Again, policies and procedures about how to use the data, decision-making rules along the way. When you get a kid who's below this percentile on this particular assessment, now you move to step B, right? Having those things written out, having an understanding of how to administer them, all of those things are really important. But keeping a good eye on your data is critical for making this framework really effective. Which is why, again, we know the tiers, we can develop the interventions, we can do all those things, but the other domains are also really important for making sure this framework is as effective as possible within your district. So just ask these questions. When you go back and look at the data sources that you have, is it comprehensive enough? Is it answering all the questions that you want? And are you missing anything? And I really think just about every district that I've worked with, they always find something that they either say, we don't have this, and so we need to find something that's going to answer this question. Or many times they will also say, we have 3 data sources that tell us the exact same thing. Why are we doing all 3? That's a good question, right? Sometimes we have duplicated data that really is just a time waster for us. So looking at, are we collecting data that we're not even using? Because when we get it, we go, yeah, I knew that. And then we just kind of move on. So as we kind of wind this down and look a little bit at the implementation considerations that we should think about, many times, especially when we have full day trainings, we hit a point to where I think everybody in the room has this glazed over look, like my head is full and I'm just not even sure what to do. And I think one of the first things that we recommend is that you go back and take stock in what is going on in your district. So looking at what are we already doing as far as your practices that you have in place, the interventions, the instructional supports that you have, the assessment. Also looking at within each of those different domains, how are we doing there? What do we already have in place that is going to be a strength for us and is going to help us to move forward with this? Sometimes when we look at what's going on in our district, it gets a little muddy though. We're always trying to do things that are really focused on how we going to make things better for students. So we're looking at things that improve outcomes for all students. And as we do, we start adding in things. We start adding in evidence-based practices and evidence-informed innovations. And any of you who have gotten a new superintendent or a new principal in the last 5 years, they always bring stuff with them. And it bad or good, right? Sometimes it's, oh, please don't add something else. Sometimes they bring in something that they had in their old district that they're like, this was the best thing ever. I'm taking it with me. I'm going to make sure that this follows me somewhere else too. But sometimes we end up with a system that looks a lot like this. And I don't know about the rest of you, but to me, if I look at this for very long, it's overwhelming, right? And I've been in this district. I have been in systems where there are so many moving parts. I don't know what's what. I don't know who's responsible for what. And many things are not starting from that point of a nice evidence-based practice and ending up with improving outcomes. Sometimes we do things, but it gets lost in the shuffle. Somebody drops it. It just doesn't go anywhere, right? I think there are a lot of times when we have things that are happening that we're like, why do we do this now? And it's sometimes too much. We've got teachers who are at the brink of wanting to retire early, wanting to go work at Walmart. I mean, there are things that are easier than teaching that pay just about as well, quite honestly. So if we start looking at what we are doing and we think, you know what, I'm gonna look through this list, but if I find something that the data is not showing us that it's doing any good, let's scratch this off the list and either replace it with something better, or maybe just sometimes shrink that menu, right? Shrink down that Cheesecake Factory menu to something that's a little more manageable. We have done quite a bit of self-study and professional development in-house here related to implementation science. And implementation science is a pretty dry subject, quite honestly. But it's really important for thinking, we have so many things that we do in education that if we don't do it well, it's not going to result in a permanent change. It's going to be something we work really hard on and then feel sad because it didn't go anywhere. And paying attention to some different pieces that are kind of under that thinking of implementation science and how do we make things really work well, all of that is really important. So in order to create lasting change, number one, we have to have a good vision of what does this even look like? So creating that clear language, creating those policies and procedures and looking for, really what does this look like for us? It's all about creating that vision. We also have to have skills, right? You can't tell me that I'm going to do physics interventions tomorrow and make it happen, because it's not going to happen. I don't have the skill set for it. We have to have good understanding of what we're supposed to do in order to really make it happen. There also have to be incentives, and what I don't mean by incentives are bonuses or increased pay or chocolate or anything like that. What I mean is there has to be a payoff for doing what we do. So if the payoff for MTSS, if we're using this to describe MTSS, is that it's going to make kids stronger. It's going to fill in those needs that our core instruction wasn't providing. That's the incentive, right? It's why do we do what we do? We have to have the resources to be able to do it. And we also need to have an action plan. Now, you can see from this chart that if we remove one of those elements, we end up with some problems, right? If we don't have a good vision of what this is, we end up with a system that it has confusion. If we don't have the skill set, we get anxiety. If we don't have some sort of understanding of what the outcome or payoff is going to be, we're going to have resistance. Absolutely, we would. If we don't have the resources, you have a system that has frustration. And if we don't have an action plan, it's kind of like running on a treadmill. We're going nowhere with it because somebody is going to forget to do something. All the moving parts aren't connected in, those nice gears that are turning each other. Now that is with just one element missing. You may have multiple elements missing, which creates even more of a problem and makes it even harder. So when we know a little bit about implementation science and realizing that we want to lay some groundwork before saying, hey guys, we're all going to start using the MTSS framework tomorrow, we don't do it that way. It has to be, let's lay the groundwork, let's prep for it, and now we're going to roll it out piece by piece so that it's not such a shock to the system. So some things that you could start doing just in trying to lay some of that groundwork within that leadership domain, starting to create a common language and a common definition and understanding within your team, that leadership team within your building the leadership team. That may be it for many schools, is saying who needs to be leading the way here. Taking a look at those resources on the Padlet and thinking, do we need to look into some of these websites? Do we need to watch some of the webinars or videos, look at some of the books, things like that? That can help kind of set the stage. Start looking at your data. What is it telling you? How are you already doing? What is the health of your system currently? Finding more collaborative time and making sure that the collaboration time that you do have is very purposeful and is used to be able to, beyond a social time or even just a planning time, it needs to be very deliberately looking at how we're going to get better at what we do. Emphasizing that whole child perspective. Many teachers have done things like using student interest cards, which are very different, of course, depending on the age and developmental level of the student, but all the way from little kids just saying, who's your favorite cartoon character? What's your favorite movie? What's your favorite color? What's your favorite candy? Things that you might want to know about a student that you might be able to use later. To your upper level students who you're asking, hey, do you have an after-school job? Do you have brothers and sisters? What is your favorite subject? What is your least favorite subject? And what is the thing you're best at school? What is the thing that you're worst at? Just getting to know students can make a big difference in how we shift those interventions. This isn't a cookie cutter kind of process. It really is, it has to be tailored if we want it to be truly effective. And then again, inventorying all your resources, it's always a good start. You want to know where you're starting from before you start making any kind of changes. We've got a few slides on here, and again, you'll see these in the PowerPoint that you can download from the Padlet. Some of these are already on the Padlet, some of them are not. These are just a few extra things related to looking at MTSS that dig a little deeper into those things. A couple of websites related to universal design for learning, which I know we didn't cover today, but it is very much connected to multi-tiered system of support. National Center on Intensive Intervention. Yes, John, can you repost the the Padlet link, please. PBIS.org, PBISworld.org is another really good website, and I may be wrong, it may be PBISworld.com. It's on the Padlet too, though. Couple of other websites. The NIRN, National Implementation Research Network, is all related to implementation science. So if you do want to know more about that, there is a lot of really good information there. So lots of resources that I would just encourage you to check out. The last thing before we just look and see if there are any additional questions, if you could complete the evaluation. So the evaluation link is either the iepta.org/eval, or you can scan the QR code that's on your left and it will take you right to that evaluation. It's just a couple of questions, but we really would appreciate that input from folks. You will each get a certificate for your professional growth points, and that will come by email. It will probably come either at the end of this week or early into next week. And Kiona, I will show that here in just a second. I want to make sure everybody has seen this. And Patrick's got the link in for the eval, so you can check that out. So I'm going to go back. Is this the one?
No, the one right before that, please.
So these, I mean, definitely some good resources here. We very much appreciate everyone's time today. I know it's hard to get away during the day. It's also hard to give up your after school or evening time. So we appreciate everybody's interest in the subject. And again, if anyone does have a need within your school that you'd like to talk about, maybe having somebody work with your district, just reach out to us and we'll see what we can do. So thank you guys and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.